When we first think about the process of learning a completely new language, we usually picture these grand, sweeping, highly romanticized scenarios.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The classic movie montage version of learning.
Exactly. You imagine yourself flawlessly ordering some delicate pastry in a bustling Parisian cafe, or, competently navigating a high-stakes business negotiation in the heart of Tokyo.
Right. Or debating philosophy with a local in a dimly lit tavern in Madrid. It feels incredibly cinematic.
It really does. We just envision the destination. But then you step back and you look at the actual granular building blocks of fluency, the real path to getting to that cafe or that boardroom. And the reality is, well, it's not a montage at all. It is, honestly, plumbing.
I love that. It is the absolute definition of linguistic plumbing. I mean, it's the hidden pipes, the gears, the completely unglamorous mechanics of daily existence that just, keep the house functioning.
Yeah.
We like to think of language as poetry, but really, for a beginner, it is pure functional infrastructure.
And today we are looking at the ultimate plumbing manual. We've got our hands on a 3-part transcript from an educational series called the Mr. English Podcast.
Right.
Specifically, we're examining their material, focusing entirely on the daily routine. So the transcript features these 2 co-hosts, Emily and Paul, and on the surface, they're essentially just walking through their daily schedules.
Which sounds a bit dry at first glance.
Right. It sounds totally mundane. But here is the mission for this deep dive. We aren't just looking at what time Emily wakes up or what Paul has for lunch. We're going to deconstruct how mundane everyday activities are utilized as a universal, highly engineered pedagogical tool for language acquisition.
Right, and specifically targeted at beginner learners, like the A1 to A2 level.
Exactly.
Which is such an important demographic to understand from a cognitive perspective. I mean, at the A1 to A2 level, a learner is essentially a linguistic infant navigating a profoundly overwhelming new world.
Yeah, they're just trying to survive.
Precisely. They don't have the cognitive bandwidth for abstract poetry yet. They require foundational survival skills. And routines are the scaffolding of human life.
Because we all have them.
Right. Because they are so deeply ingrained, predictable, and heavily repeated, they make for the perfect, relatable vessel for absorbing brand new phonetic and syntactic information.
Makes sense.
When you attach a foreign abstract concept to a deeply familiar automated physical action, the brain categorizes the new information entirely differently. It sort of bypasses the abstract reasoning centers and anchors directly to procedural memory.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting right where the day starts. Let's look at the overarching concept of daily routines by zooming in on the highly granular, almost minute-by-minute breakdown of the act of waking up.
The morning sequence.
Yeah, the source material immediately leverages the morning sequence to introduce the 2 characters who serve as our guides.
Yeah.
And a contrast in their initial morning energy is just stark.
It really is night and day.
Literally. Emily is introduced as this encouraging, clear voice. When Paul asks her what the first thing she does when she wakes up is, she mentions hitting the snooze button.
Which gives her a nice touch of relatable humanity.
Right, but then she physically stretches her arms and actually says out loud, "Good morning, world."
I mean, wow, that is an outward, expansive, highly positive projection of energy. She is greeting the day and asserting agency over her environment right off the bat.
Yeah.
The creators of this curriculum are deliberately establishing Emily as the idealized state of the learner. She's orderly, she's positive, and she's highly intentional.
Meanwhile, we have Paul.
Good old Paul.
Good old Paul. Paul tells Emily that instead of greeting the world with open arms, he usually spends 10 minutes blindly fumbling around his nightstand looking for his glasses.
And that is such a strategic choice. By having Paul fumble for 10 minutes for his glasses, the text disarms the learner immediately.
How so?
It effectively lowers the affective filter. That's the psychological barrier that prevents language acquisition when a student is anxious or intimidated.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it basically says, hey, the cognitive fog you feel when trying to speak English, Paul feels that just trying to find his glasses, it's okay if you aren't perfect.
That's brilliant. And it's actually through Paul that the text delivers its first major pedagogical distinction. Emily asks Paul for his typical morning timeline, and Paul says, well, I usually wake up at 6:30 a.m., but I don't get up until 6:45.
Right.
And Emily literally stops the conversation. She says, wait, let's explain that to our listeners.
Yeah.
What is the difference between wake up and get up?
Which is just a masterclass in teaching lexical nuance to absolute beginners.
Yeah. because we use them interchangeably so often.
We do, but it is incredibly common in early language learning to treat words as simple one-to-one translations, essentially flattening the language.
Yeah.
But linguistically, waking up and getting up are distinct mechanisms.
Right.
One is physiological, the cessation of the sleep cycle, the shift in brainwave activity from delta to alpha, and just the act of opening your eyes.
The biological wake-up.
Exactly. The other is physical and spatial. The locomotor relocation of the body from the horizontal plane of the mattress to the vertical plane of the floor.
Parsing the difference between wake up and get up in a beginner language class is kind of like analyzing the frames of a slow-motion sports replay.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
It takes a single fluid motion that we usually just take totally for granted, the act of starting your day, and it breaks it into deliberate, conscious, isolated steps.
And by separating the physical act of leaving bed from the physiological act of opening one's eyes, the lesson teaches the nuance of English phrasal verbs through the absolute most universal human experience.
Procrastination.
Exactly. Procrastination.
The 15-minute snooze gap. Paul has a 15-minute gap between 6.0 and 6.45, but Emily revealed she wakes up at 7:0 and gets up at 7:15. So she also has that exact 15-minute gap.
Right, but her gap has a completely different purpose.
It does. She stays in bed specifically to check her phone, which actually prompts Paul to make a joke warning her to be careful with that phone thief. It's a really lighthearted moment, but it grounds the vocabulary in modern reality. Like, we don't stare at the ceiling to gather our thoughts anymore. We grab our glowing rectangles.
We absolutely do. And the authors chose to highlight this 15-minute gap for both characters to normalize the delay. It gives the learner permission to inhabit the space between states of being. The transition from unconsciousness to active participation in the world is not instantaneous. By providing the specific verbs to describe that liminal space, the time between waking and getting up, the curriculum empowers the learner to describe their internal reality, not just their external visible actions.
Think about your own morning for a second if you're listening. Think about your personal snooze gap. How many minutes pass between your personal wake-up moment when the alarm just pierces your consciousness and your get-up time when your feet actually hit the floor?
Right. What's your number?
Are you a 0-minute hero who vaults out of the blankets? Or are you operating with a solid 45-minute buffer zone? Finding the English words to describe your specific individual reality is exactly what makes the language stick. It shifts the vocabulary from an abstract list to a personal toolkit.
And once that transition out of bed is complete, the text moves immediately from this internal space to the next biological necessity.
Food.
Nourishment, exactly. They establish a brief bathroom routine, washing faces and brushing teeth, and then they hit the kitchen. Paul lays out his requirements. He usually has a bowl of cereal and a cup of black coffee.
The classics.
Right. And Emily prefers eggs, some fruit, and she always drinks green tea, explicitly stating she doesn't like coffee.
Now, when you first read this, it just seems like mild character banter, right? Oh, Paul likes coffee, Emily likes tea. But look closer at the categorizations of the nouns they're introducing here. I gotta ask, are they just telling us who Emily and Paul are, or are they secretly mapping out a highly structured, diverse linguistic food pyramid?
It is absolutely a structured, lexical food pyramid disguised as casual conversation.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Think about it. Paul introduces cereal, representing processed carbohydrate-heavy grains. He pairs it with black coffee, which is a ubiquitous beverage associated with stimulation and the adult working world.
Sure.
Then Emily introduces eggs, covering the category of raw, cooked-to-order proteins. She introduces fruit, a massive category of natural fresh produce, and she counters the coffee with green tea, introducing an alternative cultural beverage staple.
Wow.
Within literally 4 sentences, the learner is equipped with the foundational vocabulary to navigate a grocery aisle or a breakfast buffet anywhere in the world.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And they wrap this whole vocabulary lesson in a joke that actually touches on the reality of language learning itself. Paul says, "No coffee." Wow, Emily, you are very brave. I need coffee to speak English.
Yes.
It's funny because, well, he's supposed to be the native-speaking co-host, right? But he's openly admitting that the cognitive load of functioning requires chemical assistance.
Because for the target audience, the A1 to A2 beginner learner speaking English requires a massive amount of conscious brain power.
Oh, I bet.
The brain actually consumes a significantly higher amount of metabolic energy when processing unfamiliar phonemes and translating thoughts into a new syntactic structure. It is biologically exhausting.
So it's not just in their heads.
Not at all. Having Paul joke that he needs a stimulant just to produce the language builds immense empathy. It validates the exhaustion the student feels. It's basically the text acknowledging the shared metabolic struggle of the learning process.
And because the morning sets that metabolic and psychological tone, we see that initial energy dictate how they face the outside world. The house is a controlled environment. The commute in the office, they introduce external variables, time pressures, and societal expectations.
The real world.
The real world.
Right.
And we see the pressure immediately in how they get ready. Paul is a total speed demon. He states he gets dressed very fast, usually in just 2 minutes, and leaves the house sharply at 8:15 a.m.
2 minutes is impressive.
It's very impressive. Emily, on the other hand, focuses on comfort and presentation, noting she wears comfortable jeans and a t-shirt and then combs her hair. But the real divergence happens when they hit the road. Paul doesn't drive. He takes a 20-minute bus ride. Emily walks to work because her office is very close, highlighting it as good exercise.
And during his bus ride description, Paul drops a highly strategic piece of information. He says, I like taking the bus because I can listen to an English podcast.
Oh, a little meta moment there.
Highly meta. This is a behavioral nudge from the creators. They are using Paul as a proxy to actively instruct the real-world listener on how to study.
Right.
At the beginner stage, finding time to sit down with a textbook for a dedicated hour can feel impossible and deeply intimidating. But everyone has dead time.
Dead time. Time where your body is physically occupied, but your mind is free to wander.
Exactly. Waiting for a bus, sitting on a train, walking to the store. By having Paul explicitly state that he uses this transit window to consume an English podcast, the test models the ideal behavior. It's demonstrating habit stacking. You take a habit you are already forced to do, riding the bus, and you stack the new desired habit learning English right on top of it. It entirely removes the friction of initiating a study session.
I'd argue it does more than just remove friction. Think about the concept of environmental anchoring.
Okay, go on.
If you only ever study in a perfectly quiet, sterile room, your brain associates the language with that perfectly controlled environment.
Right.
But if you're studying on a bus, with the hum of the engine, the swaying of the vehicle, the visual noise of the city passing by out the window, you are stress testing the language acquisition.
That's a great point.
You're forcing the brain to encode the vocabulary amidst chaos, which makes the memory traces more robust and adaptable to real-world conversations, which, let's face it, are rarely perfectly quiet or sterile.
That is a crucial point regarding state-dependent memory. Anchoring the learning to a dynamic environment prepares the learner for dynamic application, and this dynamism continues as they arrive at work.
Yeah, Emily starts at 9 a.m., she checks her emails, and talks to her colleagues. It's a very standard, recognizable office rhythm. And then they hit 10:30 a.m., which brings us to the dreaded corporate meeting.
What's fascinating here is how Paul defines the concept of a corporate meeting.
Yeah.
Emily mentions they usually have a meeting at 10:30, and Paul responds, meetings, the part where everyone drinks water and looks serious.
It's so accurate.
It really is. The pedagogical function of that joke is brilliant. A word like meeting or conference can feel incredibly abstract to a beginner. It lacks a physical form.
Right, it's just a concept.
Exactly. By describing the physical actions that accompany the abstraction, drinking water, putting on a serious facial expression, Paul anchors the vocabulary word to a vivid, universally understood visual image. Even if you don't fully grasp the semantic weight of the word meeting, you know exactly what a room full of people pretending to be highly focused looks like.
The semiotics of corporate boredom. It transcends cultural barriers. The posture of pretending to listen while holding a pen is universal.
Completely universal.
And surviving that morning meeting brings us to the lunch break at 12:30 p.m. Here, we see their core philosophies on energy management really diverge. Paul uses the lunch break for pure social connection. He has lunch with his friends, they talk about sports or movies, and he describes it as very relaxing. It's an extroverted, outward release of energy to recharge.
Whereas Emily enforces a strict introverted rule for herself.
She does?
She eats a sandwich at her desk, but she mandates a 10-minute walk outside after she eats. Her justification is physiological. She says fresh air is important for the brain.
Right.
She is actively managing her biological resources to maintain peak focus for the remainder of the workday.
But wait, looking at Emily's day, I have to ask, is that aspirational or is it just a recipe for burnout? I'd compare her highly optimized, health-conscious workday to a perfectly tuned Swiss watch.
The Swiss watch, yeah.
Every minute is accounted for. Every action serves a larger purpose. She eats fast to allow for walking. She walks to oxygenate the brain. She oxygenates the brain to work better. It is a closed loop of productivity.
It is.
But let's track the rest of her day. She works until 5:30 p.m., walks home, but doesn't actually go home. She hits the supermarket on the way home to buy food for dinner. That is a relentless march of discipline.
It requires an enormous, continuous expenditure of willpower. Emily operates as if she has an infinite reservoir of executive function.
And then look at Paul. Paul finishes work at 5 p.m. He explicitly avoids the supermarket. As he says, "Oh, I hate grocery shopping when I'm tired," he goes straight home and collapses on the sofa.
Which is so relatable.
I think the vast majority of listeners are firmly on Team Paul here. Tired grocery shopping is a unique form of psychological torture.
It really is.
Staring at a wall of 50 different types of pasta when your brain is completely fried from pretending to look serious in meetings all day, it's a nightmare.
You're touching on the very real neurological concept of decision fatigue here.
Decision fatigue.
Yes. By 5 p.m., prefrontal depletion has heavily set in. The prefrontal cortex has been making micro-decisions all day. Paul acknowledges his biological limits. He understands that attempting to navigate a supermarket in a cognitively depleted state will lead to poor choices, frustration, or, just buying junk food.
Buying all the snacks.
Exactly. Emily, conversely, pushes right through that depletion.
Which sets up an incredible tension for the evening. We've tracked the exhaustion of the workday, and now we see how they manage the varying levels of willpower they have left once they cross the threshold back into their private space.
Home base.
Right. Once they're home, the battle for survival continues with dinner. Emily treats cooking as a hobby. She enjoys it. Paul, staying true to his depleted state, orders food or makes something incredibly simple, like boiling pasta. But the actual conflict of the transcript, the moment of real friction, occurs after the meal. The dishwashing divide.
Oh, the sink. The sink is often the ultimate domestic battlefield when it comes to energy management.
Emily says, "After dinner, I do the dishes. I don't like a messy kitchen." Paul responds, "I do the dishes too, but maybe the next morning." And Emily gasps.
The gasp is so dramatic.
It is. She explicitly reprimands him, saying, "Oh, Paul, that's a bad habit."
And here we are witnessing the subtle moral weight placed on discipline within this curriculum. Up until this point, their differences have been presented as value-neutral preferences, tea versus coffee, walking versus the bus.
Right. No one was wrong.
Exactly. But here, Emily attaches a strict moral judgment to an action. Leaving dishes in the sink is not just an alternative choice, it is categorized as a bad habit.
Leaving dishes in the sink is like borrowing time from your future self at a terrible interest rate.
Oh, I like that.
You think you're getting a free evening of relaxation, but you're actually just guaranteeing a stressful, chaotic morning the next day when you desperately need a clean mug for that required cup of coffee.
You are deferring the cognitive cost, but the debt accrues interest. Waking up to a messy environment immediately spikes cortisol levels, starting the day at a disadvantage. Emily refuses to take on that debt. She pays the cost up front by doing the dishes immediately, clearing her mental and physical workspace for what comes next. And what comes next for Emily is the absolute crux of her discipline.
Here's where it gets really interesting when we look at how this material is meant to train a student. After the clean kitchen, Emily formally announces her evening wind-down. She states, "After dinner is my English time. I study English for 30 minutes. I read a book or watch a video. 30 minutes every single evening."
And Paul, playing the supportive co-host, reinforces this strategy. He drops a major rule of language acquisition. He says consistency is the key. Doing it every day is better than doing it for 5 hours once a week.
Wow.
The creators of the podcast are essentially pausing the narrative to deliver a direct lecture on the neuroscience of learning.
Let's actually dig into why that is. Why is 30 minutes a day vastly superior to a 5-hour Sunday marathon? Because people love to cram.
They do, but it comes down to how the brain physically constructs memories, specifically through the mechanism of spaced repetition and synaptic decay.
Synaptic.
Right. When you encounter new vocabulary, your brain creates a fragile neural pathway. If you cram for 5 hours, you're just intensely firing those same fragile pathways over and over in a single session.
Okay.
But the brain needs sleep to consolidate those pathways. During sleep, it prunes weak connections and strengthens important ones through a process called myelination building, a fatty sheath around the neural fibers to make the signal travel faster.
So by waiting until the next day, you allow the memory to decay slightly. And then when you study for 30 minutes the next evening, you force the brain to recall the information just as it was about to forget it.
Exactly. The act of recalling a slightly degraded memory sends a massive signal to the brain that this information is vital for survival, prompting heavier myelination.
That makes so much sense.
Doing this daily builds thick, robust neural architecture. A 5-hour cram session doesn't trigger the cycle of decay and targeted reinforcement. It just creates temporary cognitive bloat that is mostly forgotten by Tuesday. Emily's 30 minutes of daily spaced contact with the language yields infinitely better results.
But I have to ask, is Emily's rigid consistency actually achievable for a beginner learner who has a full-time job, a commute, and a family? Emily seems almost robotic. Look at the rest of her night. She washes her face again, having already done so in the morning.
Yeah.
She is in bed promptly at 10:30 p.m. It is a flawless execution of a day.
It is a lot.
It is. But Paul's evening is so much more forgiving. He watches TV or a movie on Netflix. He showers at 10 p.m. purely to relax before bed. He reads, goes to sleep at 11 p.m., and falls asleep very fast because he's genuinely exhausted by the reality of existence.
Yeah.
And the text gives us an escape hatch from Emily's tyranny of perfection. Paul introduces the phrase sleep in. He tells Emily that on weekends he sleeps in, staying in bed until 10 a.m. instead of 6:30.
Which introduces the necessity of psychological elasticity. Absolute rigidity is brittle. It shatters under pressure. If you demand perfection from your daily routine, the moment you miss one 30-minute study session or leave a single plate in the sink, the what the hell effect takes over. You feel like a failure, and you are far more likely to abandon the language learning effort entirely.
You just throw your hands up.
Exactly. Paul's built-in leniency, the weekend sleep-in, the occasional dirty dish, the reliance on delivery food, provides the necessary elasticity to his routine. It allows him to bend without breaking. He can sustain his energy over the long term because he allows himself periods of true, guilt-free recovery.
The curriculum is basically offering a philosophical debate on how to construct a sustainable life while learning a monumental new skill. It uses Emily to show what you should do neurologically, but it uses Paul to validate what you must do psychologically to survive the process.
Perfectly said.
This brings us to the final zoom out. We're moving away from the timeline of the day, the breakfast, the commute, the evening chores, and analyzing the structural design of this source text as a piece of commercial educational product.
Because it's crucial to remember that this transcript isn't just an artistic dialogue. It is a tool designed to generate a specific result, both for the learners and for the creators of the Mr. English podcast.
At the end of the episode, Emily and Paul turn directly to the audience. They issue a formal call to action. Emily asks the listeners to comment on their own routines, using specific sentence structures they just learned. I wake up at, I breakfast at, I go to work by.
This serves an educational purpose. It's an active recall exercise. They are moving the learner from passive listening to active production of the language.
Okay, I see that.
Formulating sentences about your own life requires a massive leap in cognitive processing compared to simply nodding along to Paul and Emily's conversation.
But then Paul has a secondary instruction. He says, and if you are still listening, comment the word routine below. I genuinely have to question the effectiveness of this. Does asking a listener to blindly type the single word routine actually solidify any language retention whatsoever? Or is this purely a mechanical trick to boost the source material's engagement metrics?
It is entirely the latter. It is the algorithm tax.
No algorithm tag.
Yeah. From a pedagogical standpoint, typing the word routine out of context does virtually nothing for language acquisition. However, from a digital survival standpoint, it is essential. Educational content creators are entirely at the mercy of platform algorithms.
Right, they need the comments.
Exactly. High engagement, even artificial low-effort engagement, like a one-word comment, signals to the platform that the content is valuable, thereby pushing it to more prospective learners. While it lacks educational purity, it ensures the survival and reach of the lesson itself. It's the pragmatic reality of modern digital pedagogy.
Paul's pragmatism extends to the marketing of the show itself. But the source material doesn't end on the algorithm grab. It concludes with a highly structured vocabulary review. Emily lists out 10 key phrases. Wake up, get up, brush my teeth, get dressed, all the way to go to bed. But here is the massive reveal in our source text that recontextualizes everything we've just discussed.
The translations.
The text provides explicit written translations right next to these 10 English phrases, and those translations are in Chinese. For example, next to wake up, it provides the characters next thing lai. Next to get up, it provides Q chuang.
Right.
We have this universally relatable story of Paul and Emily, two very Western-coded characters debating coffee versus tea and watching Netflix. But the text explicitly identifies its target audience as Chinese speakers learning English. What do these specific translations mean for the overarching strategy of this source material?
It is a phenomenal example of cultural bridging. The creators are tasked with taking an audience from a completely different linguistic family, Sino-Tibetan, which has absolutely no alphabetic, grammatical, or historical connection to Germanic languages like English, and building a bridge across that vast divide.
Sounds impossible.
It's extremely difficult. How do you anchor such alien concepts?
Yeah.
You do it by utilizing the most unshakable, universal framework available, the daily human routine. The human body requires the exact same maintenance regardless of geography or cultural background.
Whether you are in Beijing, Boston, or Berlin, you have to transition out of sleep, you have to ingest calories, you have to clean your teeth, and you have to navigate the exhaustion of the evening.
When a learner in Shanghai sees get up mapped to Q chuang, they aren't just memorizing a sterile dictionary translation. They are mapping an English sound to the exact, deeply familiar physical feeling of leaving their own bed.
Wow.
The routine acts as a universal solvent that dissolves the immense cultural and linguistic barriers. It proves that despite massive global differences, the foundational biological architecture of a Tuesday is exactly the same everywhere.
The biological architecture of a Tuesday. It strips away all the cultural noise and says, look, at our core, we are all just tired people trying to get out of bed, figure out our commute, and make a decent cup of coffee or tea before doing it all over again.
Yes.
And that profound, unifying idea is perfectly encapsulated in Paul's very last piece of advice before they sign off. He drops this concluding mantra for the audience. He says, remember, done is better than perfect. Pick 3 and start today.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this isn't just a tip about learning vocabulary. It is a fundamental philosophy for navigating any complex, overwhelming endeavor.
For sure.
Perfectionism is the absolute enemy of progress, especially in early language learning. If you wait until you have perfect grammar, flawless syntax, and native-level pronunciation to speak, you will remain silent forever.
Right, because you'll never feel ready.
Never. The fear of making a mistake heavily raises that affective filter we talked about earlier, completely paralyzing the beginner.
So by explicitly stating done is better than perfect, the curriculum is granting the learner absolution. It's saying, make mistakes, use the wrong verb tense, mispronounce breakfast. Just produce the language, get it done. Because the messy, imperfect execution is the only way the brain actually receives feedback to adjust and improve.
And the instruction to pick 3 and start today completely de-escalates the overwhelming nature of the task.
It really does.
It prevents the learner from looking at Emily's flawless, highly optimized day and giving up in despair. Don't try to memorize all 10 phrases. Don't try to overhaul your entire existence with 30 minutes of study, mandatory brain oxygenation walks, and an immaculately clean kitchen. Just pick 3 things. I wake up, I drink tea, I go to work.
That's the foundation.
It lowers the barrier to entry so significantly that failure becomes almost impossible.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking at a seemingly simple transcript about morning alarms, bus rides, and dirty dishes. But what we've uncovered is that the mundane daily routine isn't just a list of chores. It is a meticulously crafted pedagogical roadmap. From the 15-minute snooze gap that isolates the mechanics of phrasal verbs, to the moral divide over doing the dishes that highlights the tension between neurological consistency and psychological burnout, the source uses relatable human quirks to bypass cognitive resistance. It uses the universality of fatigue, of hunger, of corporate boredom to build a bridge across vast cultural and linguistic divides, ultimately reminding us that perfection is a trap, and simply showing up to try is the victory.
It transforms the absolute most mundane aspects of our existence into profound tools for connection and growth.
But before we wrap up completely, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over on your own.
Oh, here we go.
We've spent this entire time unpacking how these sources give us a perfect, structured vocabulary for a predictable day. They give us the words to describe the safety of our habits. But if done is better than perfect, what happens to our language when our routines completely fail us?
It's a great question.
If you only ever learn the vocabulary of a structured, highly predictable life, do you risk lacking the language needed to navigate the spontaneous, the chaotic, or the truly extraordinary days that fall completely outside the schedule? What words do you use when the alarm clock doesn't ring at all, the bus never arrives, and the entire architecture of your Tuesday collapses?
The vocabulary of the unexpected. The language we need when the scaffolding falls away.
Something to ponder as you go about your own highly structured or wonderfully chaotic day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We love unpacking these hidden layers with you, and we warmly invite you to return next time as we explore the next stack of sources. Take care.
Until next time.